Hello, everybody. How are you today? You're welcome to English class. I am Esther Rolongo, and I believe you're going to be having a nice time with me. It's going to be an exciting time learning English today. This video is sponsored by Eagle Learning Platform. So you'll be learning a lot of interesting things on this platform. Stay tuned as we dive straight into the topic. All right. So our topic for today is active and passive voice. Active and passive voice. Many times when we speak, we want to know in what voice am I speaking? Am I speaking in the active or in the passive? Sometimes you notice that when you speak, your expressions arranged in a particular order. And sometimes when you speak, at another time when you speak, you notice that your expressions are arranged in another order. Remember that a complete sentence must contain a subject, a verb, and most of the time, an object. Okay, so that is what will bring us into this topic: active voice and passive voice. Okay, so we want to look at the active voice. We want to look at the active voice and the passive voice in the definition. We want to look at their definitions and be sure which one are we using at a particular time. Okay, active and passive voice are two different ways of constructing our sentences. When we want to speak, there are two different ways of constructing our sentences. The passive voice is not grammatically incorrect, but the active voice makes your writing clearer and more natural. So, and when you use the active voice, it makes your speaking, makes it be in the correct order of a complete sentence. Remember that a complete sentence must have a subject, a verb, and an object, like I said earlier. So the active voice makes your writing clearer and more natural to the listener. Okay, so let's go straight into the lesson objectives. By the end of today's lesson, you should be able to differentiate between the active and the passive voice. When you see the active voice, you should be able to differentiate from the active voice and the passive voice. Then we should be able to identify examples of each sentence type. When you see a sentence in the active voice, you should be able to identify it as a sentence in the active voice. And when you see a sentence in the passive voice, you should be able to say that it is in the passive voice. Then 3, apply new understanding by transforming sentences from one voice to the other. Yes, you should be able to apply your understanding. By the end of this class, you should be able to apply your understanding by transforming what you have learned in this class. You should be able to use it to transform a sentence from the active voice to the passive voice, or vice versa. Okay, now what is the active voice? In the active voice, the subject of the sentence performs the action described by the verb. The subject of the sentence performs the action described by the verb. That is, the subject of the sentence is the one performing the action described by the verb. The action performed by the verb is performed by the subject of the sentence. So, the subject of the sentence is immediately followed by the verb in the active voice. For example, John builds the house. John builds the house. In this sentence, John is the subject, built is the verb, and the house is the object. Okay, so John is the subject, built is the verb, and the house is the object. So the subject John is the one performing the action of building the house, and the verb is received. The verb is built. The action performed is built, directly received by the object, which is the house. So when you are making an active sentence, the subject, the performer, performs the action received by the verb. And the verb is the action performed, and the object is the receiver of the action. So that is that about the active voice. Now let us move to the passive voice. In passive voice, the subject of the sentence is acted upon by the verb. The subject of the sentence is acted upon by the verb. In this case, the subject is taken to the position of the object, and then the object occupies the position of the subject. And so, in the previous sentence, John builds the house becomes the house. Remember, the house was initially the object. Now, the house becomes the subject. So it becomes the house was built by John. Sentence becomes the house was built by John. Okay, so in this sentence, the house is the subject, was built is the verb, with was being the auxiliary verb, and built being the past participle of the verb build. Okay, remember we are introducing an auxiliary verb. Remember, we only had build in the active voice, but when you want to make the passive voice, you introduce an auxiliary verb. So it becomes the house was built by John. Okay, so the auxiliary verb is was. The main verb is built. So you introduce an auxiliary verb together with the main verb. Okay, and by John indicates the doer of the action, otherwise called the agent. Okay, so by John indicates the doer of the action, otherwise called the agent. So the subject, the house, is receiving the action of being built in the passive voice, unlike in the active voice where the subject is performing the action. Now we have a change in the position of the subject and the object. There is an interchange of positions. Okay, so do not forget that when you're changing from the active voice to the passive voice, you begin from the object by allowing the object to occupy the position, the initial position of the subject, and allowing the subject to come to the former position of the object, and then introducing an auxiliary verb together with your main verb. So there is a slight change in the verb, and so we now have the house was built by John. Okay, so now note, ensure these are the things that you need to note when you want to make a change from active voice to passive voice. So these tips must be borne in mind anytime you're changing from the active voice to the passive voice. Ensure not to change the tense used in the active voice. Ensure not to change the tense used in the active voice. The tense must remain the same. For example, if you are given a sentence in the active voice in the past tense, by the time you're changing to the passive voice, the tense must remain the same. For example, John built the house is in the simple past tense. And when we are changing to the passive voice, the house was built by John. Remember, was is an auxiliary verb in simple past form, and the built is also in the is the past participle of the verb with the past tense, the simple past tense of the verb built. Okay, so ensure that the tense do not change. Another thing you should note is that you should change from active to passive voice beginning from the object. Change from active to passive voice beginning from the object. Whenever you're changing from the active voice to the passive voice, begin from the object. And that is a mistake that many candidates usually make when they are changing from active to passive voice. They tend to forget that the position of the subject and the position of the object is a major determinant in changing from the active to passive voice. And so when you change, begin your change from another element of the sentence, you are bound to make a mistake. But always remember that when you're changing from the active to passive voice, you should begin from the object. By the time you begin from the object will now go to the position of the subject, and the subject will come to the position of the object. Okay, so another thing you should note is that you should delete or change determiner where necessary. Delete or change determiner where necessary. The determiner may not be needed when you're changing from active to passive voice. For example, if you have a sentence like, John killed a big rat. John killed a big rat. If you're changing from that sentence to the passive voice, it becomes a big rat. You can't say rat was killed by John. No, you have to begin from the determiner, a big rat. A big rat was killed by John. In that case, the determiner is very important. But at times, you do not need to put the determiner. You might need to omit the determiner if it is not needed. Then another thing you have to put in mind is that you should add an auxiliary verb, like I said earlier. Add an auxiliary verb. Auxiliary verbs include is, am, was, were. So you add an auxiliary verb together with the past participle of the verb in the active voice. The verb that was given you in the active voice, for example, John builds the house. The verb is built. So when you change it to the passive voice, you add an auxiliary verb, which is was. So it becomes the verb combination becomes was built. So it becomes the house was built by John in the passive voice. Okay, so those are the things that you need to remember whenever you're changing from active to passive voice. Now, let us look at a list of some other examples and how to change them from active to passive voice. Now, look at this sentence. You have to determine if this sentence is in the active voice or passive voice. The research findings were carefully analyzed and interpreted by a team of experienced scientists from various fields. The research findings were carefully analyzed and interpreted by a team of experienced scientists from various fields. Okay? We have to first of all analyze the sentence by picking out the subject, the verb, and the object. The subject is the research findings. Were carefully analyzed and interpreted is the verb. Were carefully analyzed is the verb. Yes, were carefully analyzed and interpreted is the verb. A team of experienced scientists. A team of experienced scientists from various fields is the object. Okay, so we have to change it to the passive voice. So that sentence was written in the active voice. Yeah, it was written in the passive voice. So to fix it, we need to rearrange the sentence. So it becomes a team of experienced scientists. So we are beginning from the object now. A team of experienced scientists from various fields carefully analyzed and interpreted the research findings. Now we have the object occupying the position of the subject now, and the object occupying the subject occupying the position of the object. Okay, so another sentence is the orbit to the moon was calculated by the female engineer. The orbit to the moon was calculated by a female engineer. The orbit to the moon was calculated by a female engineer. Okay, how do you assess this statement? The statement here is in the passive voice also. So the statement is in the passive voice. So we have to change it to the active voice. It becomes a female engineer calculated the orbit to the moon. Remember, the sentence is the orbit to the moon was calculated by a female engineer. So it becomes a female engineer calculated the orbit to the moon. Remember, I told you that when you're changing from the active voice to the passive voice, you should begin from the object. And when you're changing from the passive voice to the active voice, you should begin from the subject and vice versa. Okay, so you have to practice more sentences on your own. There are varieties of sentences. So practice more sentences on your own in order to be perfect at it. And make sure that you put the notes into consideration when you are changing from active to passive voice in order to ensure that you are perfect at it. Now, here are a list of exercises for you to work on. You have to change from active. These sentences, they are in the active voice. You have to change them to passive voice. You have to change them to passive voice at your convenience. So, please ensure that you change these sentences to the passive voice and assess it using the tips that we have discussed in this class. All right. So practice questions. There are no WAEC questions under this topic. There are no WAEC questions on this topic, but the topic is very important for you when you want to do exercises in every aspect of English: composition, comprehension, structure, lexis. The topic will come up whenever you want to do exercises, different aspects of English. So it is very important that you put all those tips that we have discussed in this class into consideration whenever you want to practice. So thank you for attending to this class. I will see you next time.